Thank you very much, Malini, for the kind introduction and to the lively audience that we have here today, both physically and online. Before I start with this very important topic, I must pay my respects to the excellent work that Globe has been doing, Malini. You will recall there was a stage about 7, 8 years ago where we thought that Globe is in dire straits. And then walked in a remarkable woman who simply picked up the pieces, and in 2023 in COP28, here we are, hosted at a parliamentary pavilion, which has never been the case in the history of Globe. So well done to you, Malini, and your support team that is here, and we will continue to contribute to the work of Globe and also encourage others to become aware. Unlike other multilateral bodies and things, Globe is very specifically focused on matters of climate change and the importance of members of parliament in playing a leading role in overseeing government action, but more importantly also to push so that we can meet the ambitions that government leaders come and articulate here at these different conferences. My brief for this morning is to look at the just energy transition from a South African perspective and the experiences especially that South Africa had. The presentation will focus on basically the broad policy that informs our approach as a country and what the country position is, and it is one of those topics, honorable members who are present and also others who follow online, where there's very little disagreement amongst the different political parties. So it is cross-party, it's cross-bench, and in the delegations that attend COP, you will hear that members, whether they are from the majority party or from the opposition party, have exactly the same approach. There may be differences in nuance when you get to implementation, but generally we can say from South Africa, the different political parties are all on the same sheet. We sing from the same hymn book, and we approach our work also in the same way. Can we go over to the first slide, please? South Africa has recently been hit, the last 2 years especially, by catastrophic climatic events. And these events have occurred in some of the provinces in South Africa and areas that is the most impoverished in the country. It is not restricted to South Africa only, but it impacts on the entire SADC region and the rest of Africa as well. In response to this extreme weather conditions that we have, as well as the immense damage that it caused to the livelihoods of people, we have realized as Parliament that unless something is done immediately, immediate interventions in terms of adaptation and also mitigation and rebuilding the livelihoods of those who are most affected, people will be left behind. This is ongoing. Parliament, after the President declared a state of disaster in a number of provinces in 2022 when the first events occurred, and subsequently in 2023 again, established then an ad hoc committee to go to these areas to see and look at the damages that has been done, but more importantly, also to focus on the rebuilding and restoring the livelihoods of our people. Most of these are occurring in our poorer areas, not only in the urban areas, but also in the rural areas. Now, with the urban-rural divide, you often find that there is a lot of focus that are given to urban areas that are affected. And the rural areas, because it happens far away, it happens out of sight, very little focus is placed on that. So a joint committee between the two houses were established to go and look at what the impact of climate change is. Apart from this, just as an example, in one of our major metropolitan areas in the country, in the city of Johannesburg, in 1 year, they experienced floods, in few months later, during summer, they had snowfalls for the first time that it has ever happened. And then you also had an earthquake that took place. And then later on, you had then gas pipelines and other pipelines running under roads within the city, simply exploded due to the extreme pressure that is being put on the infrastructure. So for us, we have experienced the impact of climate change events. And those who still question the science must go back and revisit their positions, because climate change is real. It's happening. It's happening at a rate that we can no longer justify to say that it can be business as usual. In South Africa, there are very important policy and legislative responses which are locked up in some of the key policy documents in front of you. Firstly, in terms of our constitution gives the right to a safe and healthy environment and the right to have the state protect the environment for current and future generations. Very explicit, very clear. So we have a constitutional obligation, not only as far as the executive is concerned, but the entire state. And it includes the arm of state that is Parliament. Secondly, there is overall an overarching environmental legislation to enforce Section 24 of the Constitution. So a number of key pieces of legislation are there to make that possible that is in the Constitution. In terms of our National Development Plan that was adopted in 2010, the government's vision for South Africa is to shift to a low-carbon resilient economy and a fair society by 2030. And after the National Development Plan was adopted, we then had the National Climate Change Response White Paper that further unpacked what is meant by a low-carbon resilient economy. Subsequent to this, and due to a lot of pressure, Honourable Chief Whip of the Majority Party, there was always talk of this climate change bill, and it was hanging around in the executive. And members of Parliament, especially coming from COP briefings, COP meetings, online meetings, started asking, but where is the legislation? And the first work that was started on this important legislation was by the late Minister Edna Molewa, who was the Minister of the Environment, who started putting the architecture in place. We deem that as parliamentarians, we are not in competition with the executive. We collaborate, but we also hold them accountable. And the late Minister started the process, and in this 6th Parliament, we can say now that the climate change bill is there. And that bill gives further expression to what is espoused in our Constitution, as well as the other documents that emanate from it and the key policy proposals. The bill seeks to establish a robust strategy for addressing climate change and to provide measures for implementing a fair long-term energy transition plan and ultimately fostering a low-carbon, climate-resilient economy. Now, I must state that as things worked out, because I believe any crisis that occurs is also an opportunity. While this bill was being developed in government, we had the COVID-19 pandemic that set in as well. And the COVID-19 pandemic also forced us to look at things differently. The COVID-19 pandemic had an immense impact on the South African economy, other countries in Africa and around the world. And the President, taking the leadership role that government should take, then came up and said, but how do we recover from this pandemic? This pandemic cannot just be business as usual in terms of our economy, trade in general, and also how people live, or people's livelihoods. And as part of the strategy to recover from COVID, government came up that was endorsed with Parliament with a key policy position to say the recovery will be a green recovery to a resilient, low-carbon economy. And that is encapsulated in the climate change bill, and the lawmaking process in South Africa demands from Parliament to involve the public in the lawmaking process. The National Assembly when processing the bill, had public hearings around the country, and at least 27 public hearings took place, 13,000 written comments were received on the bill, and we listened to 500 speakers in front of the committee coming from all backgrounds in our country, irrespective of race, gender, language, rural, urban, the captains of industry, the trade unions. Everyone played a role in fine-tuning the legislation. That is why it came as no surprise that when the bill finally appeared in front of the National Assembly, it was unanimously adopted by all the political parties that is represented in Parliament. The bill is now in front of the Second House of Parliament, the National Council of Provinces, where they will also embark on a public participation process, and hopefully by the end of March next year, the bill will be ready to be adopted and considered by the National Council of Provinces, and then it will go to the President for his assent. Out of the climate change bill, we can clearly pick up key elements as it is there. And that is our approach to the just transition framework. Now, the just transition framework is customized in each and every country based on our various experiences, on the structure and the nature of our economy, and also what the challenges are. And our people still experience poverty, inequality, and unemployment. Now, to be just, we need to improve the livelihoods of our people. We need to take into consideration what our people are currently engaging in terms of the economy, and how this transition will impact on their livelihoods. It is thus an inclusive approach. It requires the active support of workers and communities that will be affected by mitigation-induced economic shifts and the physical impacts of climate change. And opportunities is arising where we can then structurally change the economy. In terms of the just transition framework, specific focus was placed by the government in dealing with climate finance. And South Africa, at COP26 in Glasgow, was one of the leading countries in terms of putting proposals forward to say, this is how we see the transition should happen in our country. So far, South Africa has been identified to receive support to the tune of 11 billion US dollars. What we require is 86 billion, and the costs are escalating as we go on. And what will it focus on? It will focus on the decommissioning of coal plants. More than 70% of energy, power generation in the country comes from coal plants. Now, a lot of these coal plants are old generation coal plants. Some of them are 50, 60 years old. And even if you push the capacity in those plants, it often leads to breakdowns. And those breakdowns have a direct impact on our economy. So we realized that we cannot rely only on coal as the major contributor. And that's why the energy mix is important. Bringing green energy on board. Wind, solar, hydro, but also looking at hydro. Hydro is very important, and there are different schemes that's currently taking place. The Lesotho Highlands Water Project, as well as other smaller projects, to bring power generation and capacity into the grid. In terms of the financial commitments of climate finance, we must say that unless we up these commitments, it will be very difficult for us to meet our NDCs. And those NDCs are very, very clear. We have received the commitments as it is indicated there on the screen, but this is where the red flag must also be raised from us as parliamentarians. At the moment, the vast majority of commitments that has been received is in the form of concessional loans, some commercial loans, and grants. the grants make up a very low percentage. I think it's about 4% of the total commitment that has been received. Now, in terms of our national fiscus, we need to be very careful not to lock the country into long-term loans that will have an adverse effect on us. And this is where the discussion is currently taking place, to see to it that we get the blended finance right. We are very excited about the adoption of the loss and damages fund and to see that the money that is going in there. But what this has proved to us, that since the adoption of the outcome document at COP26 that talks about blended financing, it's that it's not easy to access the money. It's not so easy to go in there and say, these are the projects, because apart from putting a proposal forward, you must also identify the partners that will be involved in this process. And very often, you have very good intentions from government, as well as other multilateral institutions, as well as the countries that make the finance available, but access to the finance and implementing timeously. The turnaround time between the submission of proposals to deal with the just energy transition and the actual implementation is very tedious, to say the least. In the meantime, as a country, we are expected to implement, and we must start decommissioning coal plants. Now that has placed us at certain risks, and it places the energy security of the country at risk. At the moment, we have blackouts taking place, different parts of the country, and it has a lot to do with us beginning to embark in this process of the just energy transition. The situation is exacerbated because we want to create jobs. So there's a big demand from industry for cheaper, predictable energy supply, so that factories can run 24 hours a day. That's important for industrialization. Secondly, we have a transition and a migration of people from our rural areas to our big metropolitan areas. That places further strain on the available energy supplies that is there. As you have more people moving from the rural to the urban areas, they require electricity so that they can be safe, they can move away from other types of mechanisms that they use to generate their own energy supply, and it places their security at risk when they use things like, for instance, paraffin and other liquids to generate their own power. So we have a responsibility to see to it that we provide for them as well. So you have on the one side your big industries, your factories must run, you have a local demand from the population, but then also we need to engage in the just transition process. As more people move around, they need green transport. It must be there because it's part of our NDCs that we have committed to. We must move away from relying only on petrol and diesel, that is the fossil fuels, for our public transport, but especially also for private vehicle use. The public transport in South Africa is still in a developmental stage. And what you find is that most of the public transport and transport for private use still rely on the traditional way. Go to the garage, fill up your car, and there you go. Now, we have commitments and we have factories from abroad, big motor manufacturers in South Africa, from Europe, and it links up to the discussion we had yesterday where we said, listen here, we have made certain commitments, and these countries are now telling us, especially in terms of the EU, by 2026, we are going to import electric vehicles from you. But the question thus arises, where does the energy supply come from to manufacture these vehicles? Is it still the conventional, traditional way, or is it clean, green energy that's being used? That places the industry in South Africa at risk. So we know we must transition towards electric vehicles. What impacts on electric vehicles currently in South Africa and the production thereof and the use of it is the unreliable supply of energy. So the sooner we do this transition, the better for us. We are aware. but we require a lot more resources that's not locked up in loans, in conditional grants. We require a lot more so that we can have this burgeoning of green finance coming in to kickstart those industries where we can meet our commitments. We are committed to limiting the temperature increase to 1.5, and we believe South Africa, as a country that's richly endowed with sun, with wind and water supply, bringing it into the energy mix can happen. We must not also lose sight of the fact that in our energy mix, to achieve this, we will unfortunately have to expand and look at our nuclear capacity that is there. There is a nuclear power station on the west coast of South Africa. It is currently undergoing major work to ensure that we extend the life expectancy of Kuburg. But we must also keep in mind that other capabilities will also have to be brought on board. It is not only an energy risk for us to be over-reliant on one source, but it also causes security risks for us. And those security risks must be dealt with by bringing on other forms. Gas will play a role in our energy transition. It will be there. But as we bring the renewables on board, of course there will be a scaling down on the fossil fuels that is there. We cannot as a country afford to one day switch off all our energy supply that is derived from our traditional source and historical source, which is fossil fuels, and the next day think we have enough renewables on board. Renewables requires big investments, and the technology transfer is not taking place at the rate that we anticipated between the developed countries and our local industries. We are also facing a challenge that the sun and the wind more than the sun, is not as predictable as people think. So you have times during the day when the sun is shining and you have all this energy coming in and there's almost an oversupply. But in the evening, the sun is not shining or the wind drops. What do you do then? So you need battery capacity to store that energy. And those are very, very expensive. And that industry is also in its infancy stage. And we require further international collaboration to further enhance our capacity to store excess energy so that it can be pushed in the grid when demands peak in the evening, when the sun is not shining and the wind is not blowing. So we've got a big task. In terms of the climate change bill that is being processed, there are our targets in terms of our NDCs. The energy sector knows exactly what their responsibility is. And to finally emphasize this point, it needs to be financed, well managed, it needs to be just, and it needs to be equitable. Can we go to the next slide, please? This is the sticking point at the moment in our country, the decommissioning of our coal power stations. The government identified at least 4 different coal power stations for decommissioning by 2030. The first one is the Komati power station, and that process has happened. But now you can understand and try to appreciate the situation that people who live in these massive coal towns, the schools are there for their children. Their livelihoods are there. The adults who have worked it and employed in the coal plants are no longer in the coal plants now. They have been redirected to other plants where they are working. So they're no longer in Komati. And that was the rush that was taking place. Get them out, shut down the coal plant. But at the same time, there's now an increased energy demand in the country. And people are turning around and say, but that power station produced so many. This is the gigawatts that we received. This is the input that we received into our system. Why did you shut it down? It becomes a political problem as well for the government. Secondly, in the downstream economy, the people who worked in the downstream economy, your small and medium enterprises who made a livelihood out of the coal plant, all of a sudden have nothing to do. And they must also leave the town. And I've once visited the UK, and specifically also in Scotland and in Germany, where we actually witnessed ghost towns developing, where people, a lot of them stay behind, mainly women and children who stay behind. There's no economic activity any longer. Their husbands and others are working in distant areas, or they simply became unemployed. And the other industries simply leave with it. Now in South Africa, with the levels of poverty and unemployment that we have, we cannot afford to do this. Most of these power stations are in one province, Mpumalanga in South Africa. And the impact that it can have on the rest of the province is immense. Now, we are not saying that we must not move towards decommissioning, but before we decommission, we must ensure that these towns and these power stations are not used as guinea pigs, and it's implemented in a wrong way. What you require is that the reskilling must take place now already. The training for new industries. Those in new industries, the green industries that are envisaged to take place and to be implemented, must come on board now already. So that as people are being retrained, reskilled, and you repurpose these power stations in towards green power stations, doesn't happen after the power station has been shut down, because there's a lull in activity then. And it doesn't breed confidence for other towns and other power stations that will be affected by it. As a result, we need to ensure that the decommissioning must be inclusive, and that the surrounding communities and associated businesses are not negatively impacted upon. Thus far, $47.5 million that was earmarked for creating green jobs and businesses in these communities has not been allocated. So there you have it. We have the allocation, we have access to the funding or the loans or whatever is there, but it's not allocated. Why? Because of the tedious process in bringing these programs from the World Bank and other institutions on board so that they can absorb the pressure that is there. The scary part is, in the immediate future, up to 48,500 jobs are expected to be lost. That's direct and indirect jobs, if we meet our decommissioning target of 6 coal plants by 2030. So what do? Do you now go back on your NDCs? No, we can't do that. We need to become smarter. And parliamentarians have a role to play, especially those from that province or provinces that are affected and those constituencies that are affected. It also means that there must be increased oversight from parliamentary committees on the towns that will be affected by the decommissioning. It also means that the Standing Committee on Finance and Appropriations need to interact with the Minister of Finance, the Minister of Minerals and Energy, the Minister of Trade and Industry, the Minister of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment, and so forth, to ensure that we put the basics in place before decommissioning start. If it means going back to our partners in the World Bank and to try to reprioritize the implementation plan, then that must be done. You see, because if you are a government of the people, you must take the people with you. You can't leave the people behind. If people are left behind, it's not a just energy transition. Then you're doing it for other reasons and not in the interest of the people. We are a government that is based on the will of the people, and we must listen to those who are adversely affected. The current energy challenges, as indicated before, demand exceeds supply. The supply is negatively affected by these old generation power stations and our over-reliance on one source of energy generation, and that is coal. There's a maintenance backlog in several of these power stations, and most of them are on average 42 years old. And that is why the load shedding is taking place, and the slow installation of renewable energy is having an adverse impact. To achieve our 2050 target, that's also in our NDCs, we will have to install 119 gigawatts, and that is 7 gigawatts per year. in terms of the coal sector and why we must implement the just energy transition properly is that overall there will be 90,000 people that will be affected. Here, 170 indirect jobs will be lost if the decommissioning happens at the pace and the manner that it is currently taking place. The province that I refer to, Mpumalanga, 60 to 70% of that province and the economy is dependent on the coal value chain. The 90% of the renewable energy jobs that are there are temporary, and some are even being located outside of the province of Mpumalanga. So where all of this is happening, some of the jobs are created outside for different reasons. It is unclear where the cost incurred can be afforded and the risk associated with debt and job losses are manageable. South Africa do not have the capacity to manufacture renewable energy technologies at the required scale and the rate. And that's why partnerships is important. And that's why we must work with international partners. And while dealing with this difficult implementation process, and I must emphasize, we are not talking about the revision of our commitments. We are not talking about the revision of our approach as a country in terms of the transition to a low carbon resilient economy. We are saying let's fine tune and let's fix that needs to be fixed. We cannot continue on a trajectory that we see will lead to unintended consequences going down the line. I've espoused to the limited fund support that is there. I've referred to the skill and the reskilling of the affected workers. That's not happening at the pace that we anticipated. And we also need to deal with the socio-economic impact that will arise from the energy transition. The reality is, with the history of migrant labor in South Africa, you have a situation where the wife and the children are left behind. The husband goes and he works elsewhere. The just energy transition cannot feed into this process because then we are not addressing the legacy of the apartheid system in South Africa and also creating a new green resilient economy. While the coal transition is inevitable, it must happen. Adequate support for vulnerable workers and communities must be prioritized before the decommissioning takes place. Parliament, through its committees, will have to keep track of all the stages of the just transition to mitigate unintended consequences. There should be clear technology transfer, capacity building, small and medium enterprises support, and social safety nets for communities that will be affected. Climate finance should be made available to enable achievement of greenhouse gas emission targets, build a climate resilience, and advance sustainable socio-economic development. Finally, the transition is not about just reforming an economic system in South Africa. It is about people. It's about ordinary people who are affected, one, by the adverse effects of climate change that is hitting different parts of the country, and secondly, it is affecting the livelihoods of people who are living in these towns and in these communities where the just energy transition is expected to take place. There are lessons that we have learned from the decommissioning of power stations, coal power stations in the UK, France and Germany. We cannot go on the same trajectory. Our people will not support that. And that is why we must continue, government, working with parliamentarians, working with civil society, the private sector and international partners to reposition our approach in terms of the just energy transition. And I thank you very much.
Remain behind the podium. So we'll open it up for a discussion now. Very, very challenging scenario you've laid out here. And I think the key challenges, in addition to the ones that you've mentioned, of course, you've mentioned finance, you've mentioned the need for reskilling, you've mentioned the challenges of vulnerable communities who are locked into industry towns. They can't quite so easily relocate. But of course, it also implies a tremendous challenge for the planning processes. Yeah, so we know that not so far away, there is a various committee discussions taking place on the energy transition in terms of planning that at a government level, at an industry level, and just one floor below us at the towns, villages, and cities level. So I wonder if we could draw you out on the planning challenges that there are, especially for, you mentioned the focus traditionally has been on the urban sector and not enough on the rural sector, which is experiencing many of the impacts. But for both of those, where's the responsibility lie for planning a managed transition? And I see that there are other colleagues who've joined. I'd open up the discussion for those who wish to raise their hands and raise a question, but I thought let's get the discussion going.
Thank you, Melanie. The President, in his address to the Conference of Parties COP28 a few days ago, gave a copy, a comprehensive, detailed copy of South Africa's approach to the just energy transition, and this is an implementation plan. It's no longer just a conceptual document, it's actually a plan. And what is important is now is for parliamentarians to unpack this plan and to see on which committees of Parliament it has a direct effect. And if necessary, I've discussed it with the Chief Whip, is to say that we have an overarching structure called the Steering Committee on Climate Change to play a very direct role in terms of this implementation plan. Secondly, there are a lot of work that's currently being done. It's not as if nothing is being done in other areas. I focused especially on the coal power stations and the decommissioning thereof. There's a lot of local initiatives taking place in metropolitan areas. In metropolitan areas such as the city of, or metropolitan area of eThekwini, that is in the Durban area. You can come down to Buffalo City, metropolitan area, Nelson Mandela, and also Cape Town. Cape Town is also doing very good work, where you can see that those industries and businesses that rely on a reliable, predictable, and consistent power supply have now transitioned already. And it's no longer strange that you see that on the roofs, solar panels going up everywhere. When you drive on our national roads and our provincial roads, you can see the wind energy farms, massive farms going up. And the idea there is to take away from the national power grid those who are enabled and by the means who can produce their own energy. Also, in terms of the independent power producers, there's a new bid window, is it bid window 6, that will be opening soon, that will bring more independent power suppliers into the national grid. But it is also dependent on ensuring that our national grid becomes green. And that will require substantial investments as well. The national grid, while it is constrained at the moment, must be expanded. But that expansion should be a green energy expansion, so that our independent power producers can play that role. So looking forward, and in terms of this implementation plan, and bringing on board those mechanisms, and I'm focusing now on the urban areas especially, it should relieve the demand on supply for businesses, industrial areas located in those areas. In our rural areas, and South Africa is richly endowed with a lot of mineral resources. You have mines who are now producing their own green energy. Because for them to simply shut down at any given time or for 4 hours a day be without power supply is disastrous. There's massive consequences for them. So they've been given, and the legislation has been changed to allow them to generate their own power supply so they can operate whenever they want to. They are no longer relying on the national grid only. But we must also keep in mind our rural areas. And in our rural areas, there's different initiatives working, different South African government departments, working with NGOs, and also with international partners to bring green energy to those rural villages. I am co-chairing the ad hoc committee on floods and disaster and the recovery that is taking place, and we've gone to the rural areas of 7 provinces in South Africa. And there you can see whether it's in terms of water, because our people there require clean drinking water. And when they don't have reliable water supply and the pumps don't work or the pumps are outdated, you will find that they don't have drinkable, potable water. or electricity, the traditional way of collecting wood and starting a fire to generate electricity, you find now, and that is a program that must be accelerated. You find now that there is green energy for a local village, local women taking the initiative and working, collaborating with others, where you can see smaller solar panels going up. Not only for electricity and power supply, but also to provide the power that can get the pumps pumping water again, clean water to them, because they are very remote. You also find that they come up with very innovative ways of transport, how they pool their ideas and resources together to try to minimize, and it also impacts on the reduction of poverty, how they can minimize their reliance on the traditional fossil fuel for their vehicles that is there. So there's a range of different initiatives that are taking place. Hydro, I believe, in South Africa is largely untapped. And when I refer to hydro especially, it is the water that comes from our big hydro dams going to the different water and sanitation treatment plants for consumption. But in those pipelines, there is a possibility to generate power from the flow of water in those pipelines. And that is where rural communities can directly benefit from, because you find that your dams are in the remotest part of South Africa, in the country, but the pipelines run towards the urban areas. So why can't we tap into those pipelines, those massive pipelines, and generate electricity for the local communities? Thank you.
From your response there, just to share a personal anecdote, I used to be on the advisory board for the world's largest mining company for many, many years, BHP Billiton, and had to travel to South Africa on occasion. And what was clear, this is in the mid-2000s, was that we lauded South Africa as a country which had made the rural electrification transition so quickly. Very, very rapidly, the entire country was electrified, whereas other countries were not making that transition equally rapidly. And it seems in retrospect that that opportunity to have leapfrogged was missed. Now, of course, it's been connected. There are a lot of countries, of course, correcting. But at least you had the majority of the population covered by the grid. As you said, you need a smart grid now. That's the real challenge. So I want to pick up on your point. At this COP, starting from COP26 in Glasgow, we heard this phrase, phase out. Phase down or phase out of fossil fuel. So of course now there is a new term which is being used, which is phase up renewables. So in terms of South Africa's journey, you're phasing out, there is a commitment to net zero by 2050, but in your slide you mentioned the need to bring renewables up commensurately as you are phasing out the dependency on fossil fuels. So if you can speak a bit more about the planning behind, in this implementation document, for example, of phasing up renewable supply. You've mentioned one hydro, but the entire mix.
Our partnership with international partners, I've indicated earlier that in terms of generating electricity from the sun and the wind, that's being implemented, it's rolling out. So that's part of the phasing up, but at a bigger scale, right? Some people thought initially it's a few vanity projects, you know, being used as guinea pigs to see what's going to happen. I can tell you that the opportunity that comes from the load shedding and blackouts that are taking place in the currently has now increased the need for scaling up substantially, bringing more role players in, loosening up the licensing processes, ensuring that the regulatory environment is in place to deal with greater upscaling of renewables. What we also witnessed is business, and business is in the business of making money. So unless you keep them involved, they must not be narrowly focused only, and I'll use an example, on their gold mine or iron mine. There's a community living around that mine. You cannot justify, if you start moving towards renewables in the mine, that the mining town doesn't benefit from that. That's inexcusable. And that is the direction in which we are using. And working with our private sector, which is a critical component of this, there is responsiveness. that we are seeing. Sometimes you must nudge them a little bit more, but they also look for incentives. It must be incentivized. And the government must continuously look at the incentives, whether it's through tax or through other measures that these companies have. But when you rebuild a country, and we say we're moving towards a green, low carbon, resilient economy. It's quite a loaded term. We must also deal with the legacies that are still there of underdevelopment in these rural areas that was caused by apartheid system. So we need to address that, but this is where the opportunity comes in. Doing things differently, trying new things, implementing at the rate and everybody getting their hands dirty. We must never allow this transition process to fall into a debate of us pointing fingers at one another. No, you were supposed to do that, and do what you are supposed to do. Do what you're supposed to do, put the monitoring mechanisms in place, and I believe in measuring the input and what the output is, so that we can say we are indeed busy with this. Our international partners will in fact demand this from us. They will say, where's your reporting mechanism? Are you really giving us what we are expecting? Yes, we are asking for more, but I believe in upscaling our non-renewable or our renewables and downscaling our non-renewables. We will be on the path to the transition. We also have to ensure that we don't look at South Africa only in its own national borders context, because we also have a responsibility with our people in the SADC region. And even at that level, collaboration is taking place now, because they are also busy with their own initiatives. And at times where we have a shortfall in terms of our supply that doesn't match demand, there's an opportunity to bring some of their excess generation capacity on board so that we develop the region as a whole. South Africa is still being viewed in Africa as the most developed and advanced country. And because of that, we attract migration from across Africa. So we cannot only be inward focused, but we need to be regional focused and also continentally focused. Our universities play a very important role in terms of preparing the new scientists. Our colleges are important in preparing those who will be technically capable to implement. And may I say that doing oversight across the country, we meet young people who are resilient, who want to make things happen. And we must encourage the youth. We must also continue giving support to different women initiatives that are taking place in our country. Most of the rural areas is populated by women, and the wonderful initiatives that they come up need support, small business support, so that they can turn those initiatives into viable economic opportunities for them. Thank you.
I know that there will be questions in the audience. We started a little bit late, so I'm going to use Chair's prerogative to just move us a little bit beyond the hour. You mentioned the opportunities that there are in the region for transboundary energy trade. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit more of that. You also mentioned in one of your slides and picked up on it, the challenge for reskilling and retraining the current workforce, but also the future workforce. You mentioned the role of universities. Yesterday we heard at a panel just here on how in the United Kingdom the political leadership had missed the opportunity to really have a focused strategy on the green skills transition, and there wasn't one in the UK. So is that part of the plan when the climate change bill is legislated into an act? So let's have responses to those two, please.
Let me start with the last one, the climate change bill, which is a very broad legislative policy position of government that the government will be pursuing. Out of that will flow responsibilities for the different government departments, that they will have to develop the implementation plans. And then also what it does is apart from giving responsibilities, it will also require reporting on what is taking place. The climate change bill also, we talk about our people, and our people includes everyone. It includes your business, civil society, everyone is included in working towards this transition and the low carbon resilient economy that we're talking about. So we expect that each and every department will come, regulations will come, will flow from it. Part of it will say that simply we can't fund the following industries anymore. because we are committed to this type of economy. And it will filter down the value chain into our provinces and into our cities. And I see the big opportunity, especially in terms of that implementation process, coming from our big metropolitan areas, where they must do things differently. Whether it is the design of buildings, so it requires architects to be trained in a different way. Our universities are becoming more and more responsive. University of Cape Town, Stellenbosch, Nelson Mandela University, Wits University, all of them now have dedicated climate change departments. And they offer very specific courses. But one of the things we do in South Africa that's probably unparalleled in the rest of the world is that we say that the poor people, those who cannot afford decent human settlements, housing, for them, the government gives a house for free. You don't pay for it. So that is where we can start. In the design of those houses, in terms of a water supply, getting basic things like water tanks next to houses, but also in terms of putting a solar panel on these houses. The government is building, or has built since 1994, millions of houses. And that can deal with that. So those interventions we expect coming from specific departments. But more importantly, in terms of the reskilling part, and I like to focus on the youth first, because it's an opportunity. The government also has a program where we give a bursary to a poor child who can go and study at a university in an identified course, where we see the demand will be going forward in the next 5 to 10 years. We see these are the growth sectors in terms of skills. So we give them bursaries to go and study. They don't need to repay those bursaries. All that we expect from them is they must study and pass at university so that they can become part of the broader skills pool. They are trained at universities, focused and built on this low carbon economy that we are talking about. So the skills will come through. At our technical colleges, those who want to do a 6-month, 12-month course, fitment of solar panels, servicing of solar panels, working on wind farms and other things. It's happening. It's not something that will still be introduced. It is happening. And as the years roll on, we'll see more and more of those young people coming on board. The biggest challenge, of course, that we have is those who have worked in the mines, in the coal mines. They know how they've become used to it. This is what we do in the mine. We extract the coal, goes onto the conveyor belt, and from there it goes somewhere else. So it's reasonably low-skilled workers that are there. Now you must reskill and retrain them. And that's why at NEDLAC, which is a body that is a collaboration between government, private sector and labor, there's increased focus on how do we accelerate this process. You unfortunately find that a person who have 20 or 30 years experience working in a mine, either they are tired of the mine is going to close down, they don't have an appetite to go and start in a new industry. Or, if they do, it will come with a lot of training for the adjustment process from one type of job to a greener type of job. And that is where challenges are being experienced. And we need, with organized labor and with business, pay more attention to that. Otherwise, as I've said earlier, it will lead to a new form of migration that we wanted to crush, that happened under apartheid, where men leave towns and they go and work somewhere else with the related social problems that are experienced with that. When it comes to the first part of your question that deals with collaboration with SADC countries, within the SADC framework, there is a mechanism that's in place to deal with complementing energy supply. And the energy crisis that we currently experience in South Africa has placed renewed emphasis on that, working with certain countries as far as Zambia to bring excess power on board. A few years ago, South Africa was a net exporter of energy to those surrounding countries. In the meantime, those countries have developed their own energy supply, and we are now talking to them to bring excess supply on board. But it's also a question of when do you bring it on board, because our peaks are more or less the same. It's more or less the same. In Southern Africa, suns shine for a certain period of time and all of us receive that. When the peak goes up and the supply is down, we also find that unless you have the technology and the capabilities to store that excess energy, you are going to sit with a problem. Because then you'll have an oversupply. I remember a time when solar energy, especially in Germany, solar or wind energy, Barry, you will know better. In Germany, there was such a lot generated that they tried to give it away for free to countries in the surrounding area in the EU. And for us, there's also lessons that we can learn from that. So, generating your renewables and upscaling it is one thing, but whether you have the capacity to store that excess energy for when your demand goes up and your supply is down is something else. And in the SADC region, while we are discussing it, bringing it on board, that is one of the key challenges that we are facing. So while they have excess supply that they can give to us, it comes at a time when we don't really need it, or we can't store it for when the demand goes up. Thank you very much.
Cedric, I think you probably preempted a number of questions, but I know that there is a question from Barry Gardner in the audience. Or just one point on the storage section. We're going to see so many more partnerships coming out of this COP. We had seen, I think, a partnership at Glasgow COP26 on the issue of a centre of excellence for energy storage from the UK. So perhaps in the next session we should organise a conversation around that. But over to you, please, Barry, for your question or comment.
Thanks, Melanie, and thank you, Cedric. And the first thing I'd like to do is to congratulate South Africa for the way in which you have incredibly ramped up the solar commitment. I think it was 345 last year, it's 650 this year, and that is a huge shift in what you're doing in terms of renewables. So I wanted in particular, though, to ask you what are the plans in SAREM, your renewable energy management plan. What are the plans in SAREM to actually keep that trajectory going? And it was very much around the two things that you've been talking about skills on the one hand. And I agree with you. If you're going to have a just transition, you really need to enable those people to transfer from the old technology. I'm not smoking it, I promise. To transfer from that old technology to the new. One of the ideas that some of us in the UK have been trying to get our government to go for, and I'm sorry to say they haven't, is for 1 day a week for those people who are currently in the mines or in other old fossil fuel industries, for the government to pay their wage for 1 day a week, for them to then go to be trained in the new technologies. And that way, it enables their income. What people don't want to see is they're told, okay, the mine's closed now you've got to go away and train, and there's nothing there for them. So I just wonder if that's an idea that you might take up where, unfortunately, our government hasn't. And the other was to probe a little bit further about the storage capacity plans that you have, because clearly that's a huge area which you need to exploit in order to be able to use the incredible resources that you do have in renewables, both not just in solar, but also in wind and wave as well.
No, thank you, Barry, and thank you for that question. I think the innovative approaches that you have, and may I say that the climate change legislation that is currently being finalized by Parliament in the second house, is a lot of lessons that were taken out from the UK processes when they developed their first climate change legislation. Unfortunately, since then you've gone through a very bumpy up and down ride. I don't want to get or say too much about that, but from the South African side, and we believe the government has a clear commitment in terms of ramping up further solar. Earlier on I said that especially in the Karoo you have massive solar and wind farms. In the Karoo, remember, we are richly endowed in the Karoo with shale gas. And when certain countries in the world went for shale gas, there was amongst different stakeholders in South Africa saying, no, shale gas have these unintended consequences and all that. And I can say, with pride that there's a lot of projects in the Karoo where literally hundreds of square kilometers have been identified for solar and also for wind. And there's also hydrogen that is being developed, a massive plant as well in conjunction with the government of Japan to get hydrogen into our energy mix, storage capacity. And that is where, when we look at what is made available in terms of financing and what are the loans, because most of it is loans, how can you negotiate a better deal, especially when it comes to the area of storage? And how can we collaborate with industries? Because let's call a spade a spade. These countries that are making these financial commitments expect something in return. They want to collaborate. It's not a gift. It's not pocket money that they give to you or donation that they give to you. They expect some form of collaboration where their industries will play a part on. That is the reality. That's how it works. And that is where the opportunity is to upscale our capabilities, and there's a lot of new technology coming on board. First, you had these massive storage, battery storage capabilities that were there. It's being reduced in size substantially. But we also want a skills transfer to take place. We don't want to be a recipient and running an expo for overseas countries to come. That is part of their commitment that they're giving. In that process, there must be a skills transfer that takes place to our people so that we can also participate in the industries that develop that storage facilities that are there. And that is work that the trade industry is currently doing, is to see what is the benefit for us making use of your technology in terms of direct investment, skills transfer, and then ultimately reskilling our labor force towards that. So that for us is very important. The mine open to any form of suggestion, but that is the type of discussion that takes place between government, organized labor, and business at the NEDLAC forum. I know organized labor have major concerns about the reskilling part and coming up with innovative approaches on how we can deal with the reskilling of workers that are currently working in mines that has been identified for decommissioning. Just think, you wake up in the morning and you are told that the place where you have worked for the last 20 to 30 years will be decommissioned within the next 5 or 8 years. You think, but what's going to happen to my family? Where's my job going to be? And I'm quite sure the willingness is there from the person who is affected in a plant that is been identified for decommissioning to say, but what else can you present to us? And we believe that needs to be improved. We need to offer them the bouquet of support to transition in jobs from what they're currently doing to the new one. But it must be concrete. It needs to be real. You deal with lower skilled workers here, most of them, majority, who used to work and they get a salary in return for it. They must know that if I go for reskilling and I go into a new industry, I will actually be paid. And this is what I will get out of it. And this is how it will enhance the community that I come from, as well as the town that we are living in. Thank you.
Can manage that just transition for the communities. There are so many lessons. Barry, you had mentioned the specific proposal before the UK government, but Cedric, earlier you'd spoken about the example in Germany of the Energiewende, where entire regions such as the Ruhr Valley, over a longer period, they have made that transition. But you are being required to make that transition in an accelerated period. As we know from Fatih Birol, demand will peak by 2030 globally for fossil fuels. So the urgency of that transition is not lost on anyone. I think in terms of next steps, what we can offer, so in conclusion of this fantastic dialogue today, it's two things. First of all, huge congratulations on this accelerated timeline for delivery of the climate change bill. Hopefully it will be passed, and we will be looking forward to welcoming the 4th National Framework Climate Change Act across Africa. Of course, we have at COP present, we have some of the sponsors, the key parliamentarians involved in the passage of similar climate change legislation in Kenya, in Uganda, and in Nigeria. And I hope that we can create a dialogue amongst the 4 countries as to what they can learn from each other. And I think, secondly, that we create a forum where we can have the key stakeholders parliamentarians in the driving seat, of course, because this is globe, but also business, the trade unions, and civil society around lessons learned from the energy transition. So that's what we can certainly do from our side at Globe to continue the conversation. But your very last words, please, to our present and online audience in closing this dialogue.
The just energy transition is a disruptive process. It disrupts the existing way of doing things. And with it, we see the opportunity that is there. But that opportunity must be managed in such a way that we leave no one behind that is affected by the just energy transition. For our people to have confidence in what the government is trying to do, that's being supported by all political parties in Parliament, they need to understand that they ultimately will be the key beneficiaries. And as a whole, the country, the region, the continent and the world will benefit from a low and carbon resilient economy. It's a new way of doing things, the opportunities are there, but we must not shy away from when we are busy with implementation and we see that there are challenges and that there are errors being committed to correct the path, instead of continuing down a path that is very predictable, that it will cause a lack of social cohesion, and it can become a threat to our stability in terms of the overall objectives that we are pursuing. But thank you very much. It's been indeed been a pleasure, and I'm looking forward to future engagement. Thank you.
As the chairperson of the Oversight Committee to take this forward. Thank you so much.